Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. Today I'm sitting down to talk to Dorothy Hoddinott. And Dorothy, when she was younger, wanted to be an anthropologist and an archaeologist. But at the time when she left school, that was not an acceptable career for a woman. And so she became a teacher instead. For 23 years, she was the principal at Holroyd High School in Sydney's western suburbs. And Holroyd is situated in an area of Sydney where there's a large settlements of recent migrants and refugees. Later in her career, Dorothy was heavily involved in the University of Sydney, firstly as a Fellow of Senate for 2 terms, and then as Pro-Chancellor and presiding Pro-Chancellor. She's also been an ambassador for RACS, which is the Refugee Advice and Casework Service, which provides legal support to refugees. She was awarded an Order of Australia in 2008 and has also been awarded the Australian Human Rights Medal and honorary doctorates at the University of Western Sydney and at the University of Sydney. Now, this conversation could go in a million different directions, but what I'd really like to focus on is Dorothy's work with the refugee and asylum seeker children that she did when she was principal at Holroyd School. And we'll touch as well on the work she's done with the Australian universities since that time. So, Dorothy, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start, Dorothy. Perhaps you can tell me a little bit about Holroyd School and the children that were there.
A Holroyd High School is what we call a disadvantaged school. The majority of the students came from both physical poverty and from educational poverty. There's something called the Index of Socio-Educational Advantage, ICSEA, and according to that, which looks at finances, amount of education families have had, various other factors, 65% of the students at the school were in the bottom quartile, and 84% of the students were in the 2 bottom quartiles of socio-educational advantage. And that's because a lot of the students in the school, something like 60% of the total enrolment in the school, were of recent refugee or refugee-like background. Australia has quite a substantial refugee program, suspended at the moment because of the pandemic. And those students often came from places like Afghanistan or West Africa, Iraq, Syria, Iran, some increasingly from South America. We had people from Kosovo and the ex-Yugoslavia earlier on. So people, wherever there's an issue, people from Myanmar and so on. So yeah, it was a very interesting school because it also took in local students, most of whom were from working class backgrounds, and some of whom were from underclass backgrounds with a history of intergenerational unemployment and things of that kind. That's a tricky combination of students. The interesting thing, of course, about refugees is that they immediately want to better themselves. There's no holding back, and that puts them right at the end of the spectrum to people who are underclass, who are often locked into a sort of existential despair from which it's very hard to emerge and hard to think of yourself as being employed or having any real future and things like that. So we had those 2 extremes in the school, people who were very, very keen to get their lives back to order and people who were trying to overcome the blight of often generations of unemployment.
And so how did you deal with those? Did you have different strategies for those two different populations? How did you, as a principal?
I dealt pragmatically with them. I decided early on in the school that where as you can imagine, when I went there in 1995, the performance of the students was not very good. Only fairly low attendance rates and a fairly high dropout rates before they completed high school, and the results in the competitive examination system that we have here were not particularly good. Only maybe 20% got offers to go to university and so on. And you would think that at that stage there were a much higher proportion of students who spoke English as their mother tongue rather than as another language. We had lower incidence of illiteracy, for example. So it was a school that was in a sort of despair. It was in a bad place. And one of the first things I did was to look at this raft of school rules, and I abolished them all, really, except those ones that we had to have. Just did not hit each other. And I went into something like the best part of a year of negotiating with everybody, with teachers and kids and the parents and local community, if they were interested, about what sort of values we might have. And we came up, in short, with the idea of respect and of responsibility, which we put in a little bit later. The idea of respect for yourself, respect for others, and responsibility for your own actions. And so we really pushed those ideas. At the same time, I was very concerned about the sort of top-down way that the school ran and the hierarchy of the school. And so I abolished all of the structures that had previously operated the school. And obviously there's obviously a leadership team in a high school. There's a principal, there are deputy principals, there are head teachers, and so on. But the management of the school was really a group of how can I say, older white males who made all the decisions without any obvious accountability to other people in the school. So I flattened the decision-making processes, and I introduced participatory decision-making, so people could, from any part of the school community, could join in with decisions, because the idea was to create, I don't know, a leadership of ideas, if you like. And I was always there as where the buck stopped in terms of accountability, as were the deputies and the other executive teachers. But we wanted to draw upon the ideas and the creativity and enthusiasm and the understandings of other people in the school. That was fairly important. Then, of course, it was important to put the resources of the school into supporting the learning of the students. So I had to shift the whole school around from being top-down, teacher-centred, into having a focus on the student. And in focusing on the students, it wasn't just that they sat around and were the passive recipients of whatever largesse was being handed out. It was that they actually had to be active in their own learning. They had to be active in their own behaviour.
How did that look in practice? So can you give me some examples of how the respect and responsibility worked in practice?
Well, it worked in the sense. Let me give you an example. You know, teenage boys often resolve issues by hitting each other or doing things of that kind. And I would sit with the boys and say, you know, what happened? Okay. And the deputy principal would do the same thing. So what happened? And then you'd move into, apart from comments like, well, that wasn't very bright, was it? I'd say I'm not making a judgment. I'm not making a judgment of you as a person in this. That wasn't the right thing to do. What might you have done in this situation, which was different? What could have been? What else could you have done? And you draw out from them some idea of their own responsibility in what happened. And then you got the idea of what do you do then to set it right? Now, you can't take back what's happened. Let's think about what you do to get it right so it doesn't happen again. And then I'd say, of course, if you keep doing this sort of thing, I am going to think, despite my not making judgment, I am going to start to think that there's something a bit wrong with you. Not so bright, because you keep doing the same thing again. But we would give them the opportunity to rectify the situation. And of course, there were sanctions. You have to implement government policy on things like violence and so on, that suspensions and things like that. But we talked them through all of that, and we introduced peer mediation into the school, and trained a lot of kids who volunteered to become peer mediators, so that we could actually talk through and mediate low-level conflicts, of which there are a great many among adolescents, I have to say. Mm. And that's because of the intensity of adolescence. Young people are trying up being independent, and that brings them up against authority and things like that. But I always treated, the idea was that respect flowed every way. It flowed from student to student. It flowed from student to teacher, from teacher to student. It flowed from teacher to teacher, because that can be an issue in some school. It flowed from the school to the parents, from the parents back again, and things like that. We saw it as a very complex web of relationships. It took quite a long time to work through that. In the process of doing that, we enrolled a very disadvantaged boy, an Aboriginal boy, who'd been in something like 30 foster homes between the age of 3 and 13. He was very bright, he was highly intelligent, and he was completely amoral as a result of of his experiences. He was very hard to deal with. He was in a group home nearby, which was run by Marist Youth Care. And in the process of dealing with that boy, we realised that our approach to children like that, and to behaviour issues in general, was very similar to the one that the Marist Youth had, and they had a sort of a restorative justice program. And so we embarked upon that program with them, modified to fit our school, because we're a government secular school, not a religious institution. And we ended up as the only public school in New South Wales that had actually implemented that program in the school. Everyone in the school was professionally developed in that. All the teachers, and we kept going back to it. And the idea was to say, what happened? What did you do? Why did you do that? Can you think of a better way? And then how can you restore this? And that worked really well. And we worked closely with other local bodies, youth groups, and with the local police, and so on, with other networks to help our students, many of whom had been through substantial trauma, to sort of get themselves right, and that meant that the students themselves could retain their human dignity in these things. They weren't simply being pushed around, as happens often in schools. They actually had a say in things. They contributed to their own development in that sense. And that was really a huge cultural shift. It took, as I say, years to work through. I reckon it took 10 years for me to see the first real impact of the cultural change in the school.
And what were the impacts? What were the impacts that you could see?
The impacts were really quite interesting. And they're not always things that you can measure. But you can measure some things. You can measure attendance, for example, which is an issue in impoverished communities everywhere in schools. You can measure retention through to the senior years of high school. You can't measure things like whether there's more or less litter in the school playground. And there was very little after a while. And there was very little vandalism. And there was very little graffiti. And the other thing that was really interesting was we saw our suspension rate decline. And that was both short and long suspensions. Long suspensions, obviously, are for quite serious things, and probably there'll always be an incidence of that. But at the lower level, we saw our suspensions decline for things like physical violence, and we then saw we had more suspensions then for things like disobedience. Disobedience you can often talk through, but we were able to mediate some of the violence before it really got away from us. Because it's not really sensible to suspend children in year 7 for getting out of control and getting into a bit of an altercation. That's silly. It's far better to actually sit down with them and work through how you can handle this differently. And then there were interesting things like the level of noise in the school actually declined. And so it became really quiet. And there was a great deal more focus and on-task behaviour in class. And I remember having some very important people coming to visit the school, and we walk out into the schools were an open plan school built around open courtyards, freezing in winter, hot in summer anyway. Some architect's dream idea of how you might have a school. You walk out and there'd be no noise. And this one time, someone said to me, "Are you sure there are children in this school?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm sure." I said, "It's fine." So we walked to the nearest classroom, and I knock and I open the door and I say, "Excuse me, can I just say hello to everybody?" And the kids all look up from their work and they say, "Hello, miss." And they put their heads back down again and go on working. And these visitors were stunned that this was happening. It became a quiet and respectful place. The other thing that happened was that you are able now, looking at the different measuring points of tests and exams, you are able to measure progression. And it's progression in learning, which is the real value, not high marks. High marks mean you've got a bright kid who's worked hard and has got high marks. And in disadvantaged schools, you don't get a tremendous number of kids in the top bands of achievement because of the barriers that they have to learning all along the way and so on. But what we could see when we looked at the graphs of progress from one learning point to another was that we could see these extraordinary trajectories of learning on people. And I then thought, well, I have to look at the testing, the national testing program in years 7, 11. There's a national testing program that starts literacy and numeracy in year 3, and then again in year 5, and in year 7, and in year 9. But for us, something like only 40% of the children in year 7 had actually done a previous test. We had 50% of the students in the school had been in Australia less than 3 years. So they hadn't necessarily, that you couldn't track their progression. So the point at which they did their first test became our line in the sand. That was where we started with them. And we looked at what they could do and couldn't. And I worked in testing I worked in testing and examinations for a number of years in one of my many roles, seconded out from teaching into that part of the Department of Education. And so I'm fairly au fait with this sort of thing. And what I trained the teachers to do was to do an item analysis of the test. So we could see this question generates these responses, this proportion of kids, this kid answers this way and things like that. Where are the gaps? If there's a pattern that we see across all of the students or the pattern for one child and things, we're able to do that analysis and then plug the gaps, because a lot of our kids had a lot of gaps to plug. But what we could see was this terrific progression as they got more assured in English and as they're learning, they got more confident in their learning. And of course, I decided I was going to aim for success, not failure. I was going to make sure that I removed every possible barrier to success along the way. So sort of an impact of all of these things. By the time they got to year 12, even if they'd only been in the country a relatively short time, what we were seeing was an increase in the actual academic performance of the students. And so it was really important to do a number of things. One was not to dumb down the curriculum in any way. It was to offer a broad range of subjects, both so that we could have both an academic strand, we could have an arts and creative learning strand, we could have a technology, if you like, a vocational education training strand in learning, and people could mix and match those or move between. The idea was to maximise the effect at the higher school certificate, so that you gave people more options after that. But one of the things a lot of poor kids don't have is a range of options. Their schools may not offer the right range of courses and subjects and at the right level, and then they're sort of siphoned off into lesser roles, and that becomes then a very predictable destiny for them. So it was a combination of a whole heap of things, and then we started to see a rise in the number of people getting university offers, and so we went up. We were operating at around 30%, which was the level for the main population of Australia. So disadvantaged kids were coming in around 15%. So only about 15% of disadvantaged kids in about 2007 were getting into university, but about 30% of kids across the whole population. So those are the people who complete school. The completion of schooling is around 80%, I think, in Australia. So it's not as high as it should be. And then Professor Denise Bradley did a review of tertiary education, and she looked back down into what was happening in secondary schools as well. And she, as a result of that, she set some targets. One was to increase the participation of disadvantaged students to 20% by 2020 from the 15% it was. And the other was to increase the participation of all students to 40% from 30%. We were already at 30%, so punching a little bit above our weight. So I came back to school at the beginning, I think it was 2008 or 2009, and said to students on the first day back, well, I've been reading a report by Professor Bradley, I said. And she says, it's important to get that, Professor Bradley, they think male, and you then say, she says that young Australians, that 40% of young Australians should go to university. And so I think that from now on, 40% of you should go to university. I said 30% of last year's HSC class have got offers to university. That's good. But from now on, it has to be 40%. And they must have been listening. At the end of that year, I was counting the university offers coming in, and we went up 35, 37, 39, and I sent an email to my boss, my director, saying, good grief, we're up around 39%. And then it went higher. And and it climbed from then on, 40%, 45%. Sometimes we slipped back a little bit because in some years we had far more children who'd come from illiterate backgrounds and things, and so on. But by the last 3 years that I was principal, we were averaging around 60% of first-round university offers. That is nearly 30% above the mainstream.
That is just unbelievable.
They weren't getting high marks. They weren't getting high marks for the most part. They were getting the marks they needed to get the foot into the university.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what I aimed at. I didn't aim for, high flyers on the merit list. If you got on the merit list, that was good. That was cool. But I was aiming for the sort of sound results that get those kids from those backgrounds on the road to social progress and so on. Because once they're there, they don't look back. They don't come back. They keep going, and their children will be educated too. And that's what education does. It's like throwing a stone into the future, and it keeps repeating itself. Those young people from such disadvantaged backgrounds, I know, are sitting down reading to their children. They tell me on Facebook what they're doing. They're turning up on, Writers' Week at school dressed as some character from a children's book that they've read to their children. I used to say to the girls, you've got to read to your children from the moment they're born. You've got to read to them. They've got to understand about reading. It's so important. And so that's a sort of like a pitch you make into the future. That's a great thing about education. It's all about the future.
I just find that incredibly moving, that these children from such disadvantaged backgrounds were getting way above even the mainstream percentage of students that were getting into university. I mean, that's just so moving.
They weren't, of course, for the most part, getting into law and medicine and things like that. But some of them were transferring, so they'd start in one area and then they'd be able to transfer when their marks came in. And it was very interesting to see how many of them did so well at university. As far as I know, we lost almost no one. There was almost no dropout from tertiary students. And I'm still in touch with so many of them, and I'm pleased to be. But then we had
Did you see the same? Were you getting the same results from the kids who were recent migrants and the kids, as you were saying, from the populations that were?
Everyone in the school benefited from the positive ethos of the school. Everyone was the beneficiary of the programs that we set up, including the ones specific to refugees, who did need a lot of intervention, including health intervention and so on. So everyone who went to that school ended up ploughing along, wanting to do better, and that included the underclass kids. I remember a family that came to us who came from another state, and they were escaping from massive abuse in the family, every kind of abuse that you might imagine. The mother had never been employed. I think her mother had never been employed. The kids were sad and grubby and not really turned on. And we sit, I had an open door, so people would come in and say, "Miss, there's something you should know," or they just come in, "Can I have a talk?" And I always stop whatever I was doing for a kid, or for a teacher or parent. I mean, you can do your administration after school, and so I remember one of the girls in this family saying to me, I said, "Well, what do you think you're going to do after you finish? You're going to finish school." That was the first thing. "You're going to finish school, aren't you? We want you to finish school. We want you to get an HSC. So, okay, we'll stay on at school." And then it's, well, what do you think you might do after school? Well, I might do childcare. And you think, I said, oh, this kid, hey, come on. I said, you're too bright just to do childcare. Why don't you think about becoming a kindergarten teacher? Little children, yeah, but you have professional qualification, professional work, all of that. That'd be really good. Oh, she said, and she hadn't thought about that. So you then sort of put the idea in, and we were part of a marvelous program called. I signed us up to everything that happened that you could possibly imagine. We were part of a marvelous program called What Opera, which was a philanthropic program run through Opera Australia to introduce disadvantaged kids to opera, and the kids had 6 weeks to make up their own opera, and then they also got to go off to Opera Australia, and they got to see what it was like backstage, and they saw an opera being bumped beforehand, and then they went to opera, and the girls from this family got involved in What Opera, and that was transformational for them. Suddenly they were there in the opera house. Suddenly they were part of a bigger mainstream culture, and it gave them a glimpse of what could be their lives. It helped in their development of aspiration. We just had to raise the expectations of every child in the school, and we had to raise the expectations of their parents, and I had to raise the expectations of the teachers. So I didn't have people saying, as someone said to me the first year I was there, head teacher said, oh, this is the last good HSC class we'll have in this school. And I said, why is that? And he said, oh, because of the imports. I'm not kidding. That was the term he used. And so it was a whole raft of things that had to be dealt with, and I had to build a sympathetic base. At the time that I left the school, I think we shared a genuine common sense of purpose in the school, and a genuine commitment to the future for every child in our care. It's not one thing that's going to make it work. It's a whole raft of things that you put together. You have to keep thinking about what you're going to do. It requires a certain amount of agility. That's one of the terms that politicians like to use these days. Agile. This is the latest sort of thing. Agile. But in fact, if you're going to really make a difference in a school setting, agility and thinking off the square is really important. So whatever.
When you had a migrant child, a refugee child, come to the school, let's say they came into the school in the middle of the year, were there specific things that you needed to do for that child?
Yes. We had in the school. The school had the main high school, which ran from year 7 to 12, and we had an intensive English centre as well in the school. Now, intensive English centres are very much a New South Wales thing. There are about 14 of them in New South Wales, most of them all but one in Sydney. No, 2 now outside Sydney. And those are places where high school age children from a non-English speaking background learn English. They learn the English they need for educational purposes as well as social purposes for up to a year. And in some cases where children were coming from conflict and they were illiterate and they had mental health issues and things of that kind, could be 5 terms. So 4 terms was the max usually, and then we could apply for an additional term. It's a Commonwealth-funded program, but administered through the state. And so the students stayed as many terms as they needed to actually be able to function within the mainstream. Some of the older students went on not to high school, but to TAFE, to technical colleges afterwards. But most of them came into high school. And so they had a mix of preparation. It was English language learning. It was specific to educational needs. It was also literacy, where children came illiterate or with very low literacy. They had very special needs that are separate to and different from the from English language learning needs. So those issues were all dealt with in that period of time. The school shared. We shared the facilities. It wasn't set aside in a different part of the school. It was within the school, and but the children weren't in the same class as the mainstream. And I also had a special needs unit in the school where children who had intellectual disabilities, where we had 3 classes of children who had intellectual disabilities. Two classes of children with autism, and one for what's called multifactorial issues. Some of the children in the autistic class were gifted intellectually, but of course two-dimensional in lots of ways, facing the world. And we were able to integrate them in some classes, in a couple of cases into English classes with a support person with them because of the behaviours, and in maths and science, with the aim again of getting those who were capable of going on to tertiary education into tertiary education, where they could be looked after at the university level. And we also ran a number of programs with universities, and there was a program that we ran with big business and so on. I mean, I just saw school as opening up every possible pathway that you could for our students, because their families couldn't do that for them. So we had to be their leg up in the world, really, and we had to sort of bounce along with them through that. There were some tricky moments in all that, I can assure you.
I mean, Dorothy, were you doing all of this yourself? Because it sounds like you had a school with populations from say underclass, call them underclass populations. You have the migrant children, you've got the children with disabilities. You're running these programs, getting them with business, with universities, and it sounds like the job of 50 people.
Well, it was. We had a staff of over 60 teachers, and we had a support staff of around about 30 people, who some of whom were people who were bilingual. For example, Farsi Dari speakers who could work with the Afghan kids in the classroom and negotiate with the parents. A lot of what we did was through that medium of interpreters and so on. Often more with interpreters than in written language, because a lot of our parents couldn't read or write in their own language, and we'd have to get in additional people, as need arose. So when we had a population of children from Africa, I remember we had some difficulty in finding a Dinka speaker to work with us, because I can assure you the Dinka speakers didn't speak anything else, and communication could be a little bit strange. I worked with remarkable people. The teachers and the other people, as other staff I worked with, were incredibly committed and dedicated people, and together we worked through so many ideas. I'm one of those people who I generate a lot of ideas, so I really need people who are quite practical to work with me to get them all up and running, and that works. So we had this mix in a school of ideas and the practical application of them. I can think very practically too, as I did when it became clear that some of our asylum seeker students were getting sufficient marks to get into university, but because of government policy, mightily discriminated against, they're not eligible for any support at university and have to pay full international student fees with no chance of deferral of those fees. So I set up a program of negotiating with the universities for individual students. In fact, I'm still doing that. And then I thought, well, if it's happening here, it would probably be happening in other schools. So I then sent out emails through the principals network saying, if you have anyone who's an asylum seeker that is on these different visas or no visas, who is competitive, then let me know with their permission when you get their HSC marks in. And I will try and negotiate scholarships to university for them, which is what I did. I also set up over the last 20 years, I've set up three scholarship funds. One called Friends of Zainab, after the marvelous Zainab Kabi, who needed to be helped. So that's now with the Public Education Foundation. It is now an Australia-wide fund. It has helped around 500 young refugees and asylum seekers since it started in the last 2 years of school and the first 2 years of university. It's currently got about 130 young people on scholarships around Australia. I set up one through the National Foundation for Australian Women, which operated at our school level, and I still need to resolve that one. And since I retired, I've set up another fund through the Sydney Community Foundation. And that doesn't include all the kids that we helped at the school itself, and so on. So, I've been getting people successfully into university for a while. I managed to convince the Department of Education before I retired that they should take over that task, since they knew where everyone was. And they did that. A marvellous teacher from my school, who we'd appointed our head teacher, refugee support, went into the department and set up the template for the program. And that's now operating. That's been operating since 2017 and is getting young asylum seekers into university. But I continue to have that role, and I'm now starting to see it with people who've got a degree and who are now moving into further degrees. And that is really quite exciting because...
Interesting.
That's that whole thing. You can't take someone's education away from them. They will have that qualification. They will have the means to continue through their life in Australia. I would think that many of our asylum seekers will end up becoming Australian citizens simply because it will be too difficult not to grant them that after living in Australia for such a long time. And marrying and having children. I mean, those things are going to happen. Children grow up, and governments can't put people on ice forever.
Dorothy, do you have maybe one or two of the greatest success stories of these children?
Yes, I do. There's a marvelous young man of Afghan Hazara background, Bashir Yusufi. Bashir was orphaned when he was 12, and he escaped from Afghanistan because the fear was that an uncle spirited him out of Afghanistan. The fear was that he would be killed as well. And he was sort of launched on this trajectory across the world when he was 13. And the thought of a 13-year-old crossing the world alone is quite extraordinary. He ended up on a boat to Australia. When he was about 15, he was interned in Darwin in an immigration detention centre, and he's an extraordinary person. He's one of the few genuine autodidacts I've ever met, and he someone gave him a dictionary, a really simple dictionary, a children's dictionary. And he determined he would teach himself English and he'd teach himself to read and write. But he'd never been to school. So he starts off, and his aim is to learn 15 new words every day. And he's kept that up. He's now must be 30. He's been learning 15 new words every day. He has most extraordinary vocabulary. Anyway, he was with another young chap called Mosen in the detention centre. They both learned English by bouncing off each other. And then, of course, because they were unaccompanied minors, they were released, and they ended up in Brisbane. And they didn't stay very long in Brisbane. They made their way to Sydney. These are 14 or 15-year-olds, They arrive in Sydney, and they're sort of roughly looked after at a distance by someone. And they came and enrolled with us. And Bashir very quickly showed what he was made of. First of all, turning up to school, impeccably dressed, living with Mohsen in a flat somewhere, looking after themselves, these two kids, while we keep a sort of watchful eye, are you getting enough to eat? Yes, yes. And I can iron, says Bashir. They come to school, starched and ironed and pressed and, everything. He became vice captain of the school in year 12. He became, he then represented the school on the local student representative council and then became a regional representative and so on. He was along the way, he had acquired permanent protection along the way. And he then got involved. He got involved with, I think it was Amnesty, and became a sort of a speaker for Amnesty. He completed his HSC. He didn't do too badly. He got into university, but decided to defer, and he went to a college and did accountancy. So he got a diploma in accounting, and then he went back down to Canberra, and he got into an economics and accounting degree course at the Australian National University. In the course of all of this, he decides that he really doesn't want to be an accountant. He wants to be a diplomat. So he changes into a course in international relations, and he completed that degree at the end of 2019. I couldn't go to his graduation. I'm in touch with him all the time. I couldn't go because I was in Spain at the time. And he is now doing a master's in international relations and diplomacy at ANU with the aim of becoming a diplomat. He got involved with career seekers. I'm now director of career seekers. They help sponsor, mentor people, refugees and asylum seekers into the professional workforce. And he had the chance to do some internships. So he's now working in the Federal Department of Finance at a professional level. And he's doing this degree. He's sponsored a young woman to come to Australia and has married her, and they have a new baby. And I have no doubt that Bashir will turn up somewhere as an Australian diplomat at some point, which is a huge journey that he's undertaken. Along the way, he needed to become an Australian citizen, and of course there were impediments put up to people who had been asylum seekers in the queue for citizenship. I wrote a letter to the Minister for Immigration supporting Bashir's request for citizenship, and I was there with him when he got his citizenship. Mm-hmm. That was so important. And he's that's a long journey. There are so many like that. I'm thinking of another Afghan girl, Sakina, who was the first person in her family ever to go to school. I mean, don't. She was 13 when she came to Australia. No one had ever been to school, not her parents, no one, ever. And she went on, she was our school captain by the time she finished. She was very articulate. She is a very articulate young woman. She went on to study nursing at the University of Technology in Sydney. I was at her graduation along with her mum, who can't speak English and can't read or write English, but was so proud of what her daughter had achieved. And Sakina is specialising in midwifery, I believe. She has thoughts about becoming a doctor and doing medicine. She may well do that, but in the meantime, she's got married. She's in a very sort of modern marriage. She has 2 gorgeous children whom she adores, and she's working in nursing. That is such a journey, you know. And her younger sisters have gone to university, and it's like a liberation. It liberates people from what they might have been. We could underestimate what people could do. We could lower our expectations, and people will rise to those low expectations, you know. But we can raise our expectation. We can take away barriers to things. You know, people needed school shoes. I bought them school shoes. They needed to go to the dentist. We went to the dentist. If they got chucked out of home and they needed to find a new place, we paid their rental bond. It was just what you need is what you need, but you've got to do the hard work too. In the end, I'm not there sitting those exams for you. You've got to come up to things, but I will support you 100% of the way. And if you've had a troubled past, I'm not going to judge you by that past. I remember saying this girl sitting in my office and saying, she said, I want to do this and I want to do that. I don't want to be like I am anymore. Azina. She said to me, sincerely, I've got a past. This is a 16-year-old telling me she's got a past. And I said, I'm not interested in your past. I'm interested in your future. And she stopped. And she said, oh. And I said, it's what you do from now on that's important, not what. I'm not going to judge you by, you know, being a pest in the past. And she went on. She went on to get. She went on. We ran that year. We were the only school in Australia. It was the 10th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Women's Rights. There were consultations with women around the world in that 10th year to see if anything had happened. I'm afraid to say not a lot, but they were held in Australia. They were brokered through the University of New South Wales and run by a woman from Tasmania. And they were called caravans in Australia. I heard they were happening, and I signed us up. And we ran such a consultation at school. We invited girls from other schools to come, and we had some speakers, and it was really good. And Azina got involved with that, as did a number of other girls who later became quite public figures. And she went from there to there was a national conference held at Uni of New South Wales, and we over a week we sent heaps of girls off to that, and teachers too, because some of our teachers needed a bit of consciousness raising. And then Azina was chosen to be the youth representative for Australia at the Asia Pacific Conference in Bangkok. So we actually, because she came from a poor family, we just do a bit of fundraising there. Because I couldn't use school funds to sponsor her. So we fundraised her the costs for her going to Bangkok, and she represented Australia very well. And so she was then chosen to go to the United Nations, the Commission on the Status of Women, as part of the reporting back to the Commission on the consultations, the worldwide consultations. So Azina, by this stage, was completing her HSC. So when she went, she had just turned 18. She'd just got Australian citizenship, her passport, and we'd fundraised for her to go to New York And she went and she took part. And in the meantime, she'd been a member of the local SES, the emergency service. She'd been Auburn Young Citizen of the Year. She had sponsored a child through World Vision. She was working with World Vision as a volunteer. She then went for World Vision and later the Red Cross to a number of countries to talk to groups of young women about how they could get active on their own behalf. She works now for the Red Cross. She's worked for the immigration people, Home Affairs here in Australia. She's worked for World Vision. She's worked for a number of NGOs, and that's it. I said, and that all comes from that moment when I said to her, "I'm not interested in your past. I'm interested in your future." And those moments can be transformational for kids. It's really important that we not make judgments about people, that we give young people every opportunity to just expand and keep growing and being themselves. Really, I've got so many stories that I could tell you, which are great success stories. It's everything, the kid from the really rough Anglo family here, one of those sort of really tough, brought up in a single parent family, poor as she's a teacher now. She's gone on to be a teacher. It's a blonde, sort of sour-faced looking girl who was really cranky a lot of the time and caused infinite pain to some of her teachers. And she stayed until she did the HSC. She stayed and she got in on special consideration for people from disadvantaged background, and she's now a primary teacher. I mean, that is real life-changing stuff, and it's no looking back. They keep going. That's what it's about. You're not in there for yourself. You're in there to make a difference to those kids. And I'm particular. I've taught kids from all social backgrounds, and I'm still in touch with hundreds of them. But the really important ones are the kids who don't have anything else going for them, who really do need every resource that we can apply to them to make them self-sufficient, give them resilience, give them a way forward, to raise their expectations and things. They have to come to the party. It's not just handing it out to them. They actually had to work hard. It's like a tough love process that we went through with them,
Dorothy, I think that's a great place to end this interview. What I'm left with is just huge admiration for your energy, huge admiration for your drive, for your willingness to buck the system, your willingness to just do whatever it takes to make sure that those kids have a better future.
Yeah, I don't think they make people like me principals anymore.
Unfortunately. And also what really strikes me is just your incredible humanity.
Yes, well, yeah.
And it's so I just wanted to reflect that back to you and say, if only all school principals were like you, I think what a different world it would be. What a different world it would be.
Yes, yeah. There are so many children who are lost children, in this world.
So
there
many.
are tens of millions of children who will never go to school. And, there are nearly 80 million displaced people in the world right now, of whom almost half are children. And the reality is that those children, unless they get resettled, and the resettlement is around 150, 160,000 people a year out of that number, unless they get resettled, they have got Buckleys of ever getting near a school. And so there's this huge well of human misery and and the loss of potential that's out there. The pandemic's only made it worse. So many of you're much more likely to be illiterate if you're female. Those stats are really telling. 70% of the world's illiterates are female. So you want to be able to do whatever you can. I remember another kid laughing at Azina once and saying she's out saving the world one person at a time. And yet sometimes that's all we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you, Dorothy, for your time, and thank you for all you've done. It's been a delight to speak to you.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.